Okay guys, welcome. I'm back. It's been a little while since I made my video or a video. Next to me I have a Tanner Reed, and you are from?
Iowa.
Iowa. He's from Iowa. Sorry, I can't help but mock the accent. Do we have an accent in California?
I don't think you do, but some others might.
Okay. So Tanner reached out. He wanted to learn some things. So often, because I've been in the business so long, there's questions that would come up that I would never think to ask. So I had Tanner construct a list, and we're going to kind of go through some of those points on the list. But at the top of the list was understanding compounds. So we've got this smart car next to us, and I don't even know if it's in the frame or not, which in my world I call them silly cars. And if you own one, which Tanner actually did at one time, no, this is not his car. No offense, but I mean, seriously, don't you feel a little silly in them? I mean, I get it.
Yes.
I get the appeal.
Yeah.
They're small and economical, but anyhow, whole other video. So what I thought is, without doing much back and forth prior to shooting this video, is just have him ask questions and try to break it down, because often as a beginner you don't really know what your real question is. You just know that there's like confusion floating around in your head, and one of his biggest concerns is polishing. And I know for many of you guys that's the go-to problem. I want to learn how to polish a car. Everyone wants to learn how to polish a car, how to do paint correction. Yours specifically was scratch removal. So based on our short conversation prior to turning that silly little camera on, refine your question the best you can into a sentence or two as far as what we've discussed so far.
So, different compounds, and to what I know, do different things. From what I know also, that different compounds have more grit than others. Without the experience, I think it's probably tough for me to go to a job and know which compound to use on that certain situation. But
because and I'll interrupt, and that's the dimension of, meaning when it's your own car, it's different, because the only pressure you put on the moment is from yourself. But a customer's car is vastly different, because now you have to perform for a Johnny customer. Everything changes. So when you approach a car, and I remember this now as you talk, as a beginner, it's just like, I'm not even sure where to start. Well, where you start is with the customer, is you ask them. And so in my website, and let's say you have a website, which I don't even know if you do.
I do.
You do, okay.
Yeah.
On my website, if you check it out, and by the way, a lot of your questions, if you're trying to get into the business, can be answered just by going to my website, autofetishdetail.com. And you look at the home page, you look at the pricing structure, you look at the little link that says fine print. It will answer a lot of your questions as to how I talk and communicate with my customers. Because to me, and now that I'm thinking about this, really, I guess I'll default to this. Operating a detailing business, a successful one that's actually growing and thriving, is about, I put it at about 40% skills. Like, how to detail a car is not even half of the equation. Everything else is all about like business management, communication skills, managing customers' expectations. It's all this other stuff on the back end. So just because you know how to detail a car, you could go and pay, 15 grand from the best, detailing guru in the world, whoever that is. And then you go out in the real world and you're like, I know how to detail a car, but I'm unsure as to what to do with this car, even though you've been trained how to polish it. So what you have to do is you have to understand what the customer is seeing. So based on the initial contact, like does he call you on the phone? Does he send you a text? Did he find you through your website? Will kind of determine where you go, and then you start asking questions. Okay, I want a detail. Do they say detail or do they say paint correction? Very few people are going to call up and say, I need paint correction done. Okay, that's a term within the industry. They may say, hey, my paint doesn't look the way I want it. I see some like swirl marks or kind of miscellaneous scratch or scratching, and so that's where they may lead off, or they may just lead off with, I need it detailed. Okay, so that's different. So really, I guess without droning on too long, it's you got to start with a customer, because as a business owner, that's really who you have to make happy is your customer.
Yeah.
So in answering your question, it's like, well, I pull up to a car and I know I got to detail it. Well, A, what does your service include? Does your customer understand what your service includes? Have you had that discussion with them? Because in my detailing packages, paint correction is different than detailing. Detailing is a separate process that does not include paint correction. So if I pick their brain, and I ask them, okay, is there any specific problems? You got to understand what their understanding of detailing is. Most people are just so ignorant, they just think that you're going to come out and clean their car. Okay, what does that mean? I'm going to clean your car. Well, we call it detailing. So I guess detailing is more comprehensive than cleaning, hence the label detailing. It's not generalizing, as Steve Vandervorst calls it. It's called detailing. It's all about the details. Okay, but does that mean you're going to whip out a buffer? Because as a newbie, you may think, because in your head you're going, oh, I want to impress this customer, so he calls me back or he tells his friends and I get more business, right? Is that natural to think that?
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's natural for probably most guys out there watching that want to get into the business. And that's a valid point. But that's only part of the equation. Because what that will cause you to do is often actually over deliver your service to them, because you're operating out of fear and inexperience. So you think that if you over deliver enough, they're going to be so enamored with you that they're going to just be calling you back every month because they're just so in love with their car. Okay, but that's not going to happen. It just won't. Will they ever call you back? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? The problem becomes, because of your lack of experience, you will want to over deliver to an inappropriate level. And then you won't make money like you should be. And that becomes a vicious cycle, because you're working out of fear, which is a byproduct of inexperience. So to come full circle, it's like, okay, you've got to get into the customer's head and understand, pull the information out from them as to what they're even looking at. So they look at their car, and honestly, in my experience, very few people know how to look at the paint and understand what's going on. They may be able to say like, oh, it's just not shiny enough. It needs to be shinier. It's like, okay, well, I can just clay it and wax it and it'll be shinier. I don't even have to touch a buffer. But that's not your real question. Your real question is understanding compounds and where do I begin based on what a compound can do. Well, the simple answer for that, can you take a guess where you possibly would start? And I know this...
Buying a compound?
That's good.
Buying a product?
Actually, I didn't even think about that. Which, I mean, I would have. But that would have come later in the discussion. So the simple answer would be you read the label of the compound that you bought.
Okay.
But really, you nailed it when you say buy a compound. Because that's what I'm always going to default to. Because I promise you, regardless of what I say, or regardless of what any other channel you're watching, which everyone has an agenda, I just try to be as transparent as possible with my agenda. I'm not pushing a particular product line down your throat. I know what I love and what I use, and you can see some of them on that shelf right there. But it doesn't matter. So the point is I could convince you and make a compelling argument as to why you need this compound or this polish. And you would go on my website, hopefully, and buy it through my link, and then I get a little commission. There's my agenda, by the way. But guess what? you will never be satisfied with that. You'll try it, you'll experiment, and guess what? Along the way, you'll talk to another detailer, or you'll go onto a forum, or you'll see another video, and they'll talk about another compound, and they'll tell you how great it is. Now it's going to change your life, and you're going to be rich and famous, and have thicker hair and more money, and go down the list. And all these chicks will be flocking to you. So you're going to buy it.
Yeah.
And then you're going to buy another one, and then another one, and another one. So what's the answer? What is the best polish or the best compound? I don't know.
Yeah.
And that cannot be answered by anyone other than yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you all day long what I think is the best, but guess what? Every paint is different. Every customer is different. Every car resides at a different level of imperfections or perfection. So that's kind of, once again, to bring it back to originally what you're discussing, and this is what I tell the customer. Because generally, one of the first priorities on a potential customer's mind is cost. Mm-hmm. They kind of know what they want, but really, how much is it going to cost me? Well, what are you going to charge me? What are you going to do? What can you do? I mean, could you really answer all those questions over the phone?
No.
You can answer some of them.
Yeah.
You can say, oh, I'm going to go through these steps. So what I personally do is I ask them, like, okay, did you look at my website? Because there's lots of information there. Did you see what I cover? So based on how they respond, will then determine how I respond with them, what questions I ask them. But coming back to compounds, how do you know which compound to start with? Well, as a rule, and this is the rule that you start with, is A, you pick a compound. Well, Darren, what do you recommend? Well, if you look at underneath this video, there's going to be some links, and that will show you what I recommend. But really, you can just try anything. Because really, that's what you need to do, is get the damn buffer in your hand, understand a few basic principles or laws or rules, and then you just experiment. Because really, it's this simple. Based on where the paint starts, and based on how perfect you want it to be, and right there, those two parts of that equation are subjective, which means it's up for opinion, right? So I may look at this paint on this car and say, oh, it's at about a level 5. And you say, dude, you're on drugs. That's like a level 4 in my world. It's like, okay, 4, 5, whatever. What level do we want to raise it to? Well, I want perfection. It's like, well, really, are you charging for perfection? Well, what do you mean, am I charging for it? Are you charging your customer to make that car, that paint, perfect? Whatever perfect means, are you charging for it? Well, I'm charging him $300. It's like, okay, how long do you think it's going to take you to get perfection on that car? I don't know, I've never done it really. I've done a hood and a couple panels. It's like, well, there's a problem there, because you could spend a week on this car because you lack experience and you don't know how to get from point A to point B quicker because you don't have that experience. So therefore, at the end of the day, you're going to make $300 for a week's worth of work. It's inappropriate. It doesn't make sense. So the simple, once again, back to my example, where does the paint start? Where do you want to bring it to? The more severe condition that the paint is, and the greater you want to go as far as perfection, will determine where you start. So if it's severe enough, then you start with, and this, we need to define compounds and polishes. As a rule, compounds, at least in the professional world, suggest that it has some form of abrasives in it. And that is a more aggressive type of, see, I don't even know what term to use because they're interchangeable. So compounds are more aggressive than polishes as a rule. Compounds will, see, what you really want to do is create what I call a uniform scratch pattern. And this is probably where we should bust out a pen and paper. So here we go. Now, none of you go into freak out mode because I'm using this as a desk, all right? I'm not going to scratch it. This car is a daily driver, so let's be realistic. So here we have the metal of a panel. On top of that will be a primer coat, and I'm going to simplify this, okay? So there you have your primer coat, there you have your color coat, and there you have your clear coat, okay? Now that is not to scale, that is not to thickness, and just as a frame of reference, the clear coat, if you saw the thickness of your fingernail, as a rule, the clear coat will be thinner than the thickness of your fingernail. So it's pretty thin.
Yeah.
Now, one of the, what I call the dirty secrets of the industry, and you tell me if you've heard this, because everyone races to paint correction,
Yeah.
but do you know why the clear coat is there?
Protect it from the sun, maybe?
Exactly. It filters out the UV rays. So if you are abrading, polishing, whatever you want to call it, compounding a certain thickness of that clear coat away, guess what you're doing?
Less UV protection.
Exactly. So I tell my customers, because it's something they can relate to, is it's like, let's say you burn easily in the sun, and you're used to wearing 70 SPF, sun protection factor of 70. Now, because I've just polished your paint significantly, now you're going out into the sun with, let's say, 15 SPF. So most detailers will not have that conversation with their customer, because they will allow the customer to lead the job, because it's like, ooh, Johnny customer wants it perfect. I know I can do that, and he's willing to pay $500 to do it. Well, I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
But Johnny customer doesn't know what the clear coat is there for. And rarely do I hear that discussed on videos or anything else. So that's where I tell the customers, like, hey, you can really only make a decision that's an appropriate one if you have enough information to do that. So I try to teach them so I can help them make an appropriate decision. So the clear coat. So let's take this top layer, the clear coat, and let's gouge it up like this. And this represents a cross section of the clear coat. And here is the base coat. Now, something you need to understand, let's put a big scratch there. Here's another big scratch and some other scratches. And then we have like really fine, what I call wash, scratch, or spider webbing effect.
Yeah.
This resides at the very top. Then you have your deeper random scratches, which they call rids in the industry now. Random isolated deep scratches, I think. I call them dicks, D-I-C-S. Deep, or what did I do? It's like deep, individual correctable scratches. I was just being a smartass.
Yeah.
Because all these acronyms, they just drive me crazy. Because beginners don't know what they mean, and you'll go on a forum or the Facebook, and someone will have like 2 sentences, and it'll be filled with 10 acronyms. It's like, dude, I don't speak in hieroglyphics, I don't speak in emoticons. So can you spell it out for me? So these are deeper scratches, and at the top are what I would call more superficial scratches. So a couple of things you need to understand about the clear coat is that it literally is the UV protection for the color or base coat. So here we have color or base coat. Once, that's supposed to be a T, I'm kind of writing sideways. Once you polish through, sand through, whatever, this clear coat, guess what happens to this base coat?
Fades, maybe?
It will eventually, but the bigger problem that's immediate is that it will change its color.
Oh.
It will change the appearance of that base coat.
Okay.
So once you ring that bell, there's no unringing it. You can't go back. You can't put the clear coat back on it. You can't bust out a can of clear. I mean, you could, but it would look like caca. So that's what you have to keep in mind, is that this clear coat is very thin, and you're removing that UV protection in the process of compounding it or polishing it. Once you go through it, it will change the color of this. So this is where I tell customers. So because I think it's inappropriate for most people to have their paint raised to anything above what I call a level 8 or 9. 8 is doable. Like if it's a daily driver and they're going to be willing to maintain it, then I'm okay with them doing an 8. Or I advise them. It's like, okay, I think 8's appropriate. Anything past that becomes a more narrow group of people. which is, okay, it's my weekend cruiser, Darren. It only gets out on the weekend. I come home, I dust it, I use a quick detailer on it, whatever. It's like, okay, in that case, then perhaps a 9 or a 9.5 would be appropriate. So to answer your question specifically, the deeper or the more gouged up this is, the more aggressive you want to start. But how do you determine that? Well, that's where the labeling comes in for a beginner. You read the label. That's also where experience comes in, because I know there's certain compounds that are more aggressive than others, and just like you, I'm at the mercy of the manufacturer in the label and what their advertising is. Now you can obviously buy it and you can experiment with it, and that's what I essentially tell people. It's like, you know what, just pick something. Just know that compounds, like you were saying, compounds will do the heavy lifting. So we could put compounds equal heavy lifting, as in the most aggressive. And what they do is they literally, you're scratching your way to perfection.
Scratching it until you get below that
level
you're at.
Exactly. So if we wanted to remove all these blemishes, we would literally have to either sand or polish all the way to the deepest scratch. Now remember, this is what do they call that? A side cut? What do they call, like when you take a side section, you cut it, and then you turn it, and you're now looking at the side of that. So these are if we were looking down upon it, you would see scratches going all different ways. You would see this wash scratch or spider webbing, and this is why people call it swirl marks, is because it creates a circular pattern. Well, the reason it does that is because the sun is round, and when it is reflecting onto that, it will just naturally create a circular pattern. I promise you, all those scratches are not in a circle. If they were, every time you change direction, why does it always create circular patterns? Not that some of them aren't. I'm just saying is that really what it is just endless scratches going, thousands of different directions. Gotcha. So, I'm trying to remember. Okay, so to me, removing that much clear coat on most cars would be inappropriate. Now, this is a common question. So a lot of people, well, let me define this first. We have polish equals gloss enhancement. Let's just call it glossing. It creates shine. So compounding as a rule is first, polishing is second. And this is where the industry will have you buy like 3 different levels of compound or polish. They want you to buy 3. Well, guess what the industry is doing now is they're creating a one-step or a true all-in-one type of compound that you can do the heavy lifting with, but also finish. Okay. But this is also where your choice in machines and polishing pads and speed come in, is that you can basically fine-tune the amount of heavy lifting you're doing. You can fine-tune the polishing you're doing. So I can take a compound and switch pads and switch speeds and back off on the pressure, and guess what? Now I've just turned that compound into a polish. Okay. So you really retain so much control. Yes, you're limited by the product. There's going to be certain limitations to it, but there's still a wide gap as to how you can tweak it or finesse it based on, once again, the type of machine you're using, the type of pad, the pressure, the speed, how long you sit in a particular section of the paint. So you can tweak each one of these, but you're limited. So for example, let's say you have a polish with a very fine abrasive to it. Well, guess what? It's only going to cut so much. I don't care how much speed, how much friction, how much heat, how much pressure, it's still only going to do so much. Now maybe that's where time comes in. Maybe if you held it in a spot long enough, it could kind of overcompensate for lack of aggressiveness. So that's where experience comes in. And that's where reading the labels come in, is that you reading the label will be a starting point. It will offer some really good suggestions as to what type of results you can expect from that. but you just know that you can always tweak it.
You won't completely understand the product until you actually put it to the car.
Exactly. And once again, that's only part of the equation, because the other part of the equation is this. Clear coats, like everything else, are not all created equal. There really is some clear coats that are softer than others. Ceramic-based type of clear coats, very hard. But they're not all created equal. And they vary, just like cars themselves, they vary dramatically in fit and finish, quality, cost, same with anything else in life. So all of this is only part of the equation, because this is your canvas. So once again, and based on how marred up or scratched up it is, also based on how soft or hard that this clear coat is, and just when you go on forums, sometimes they'll say, oh, all German cars have hard clear coats. All Mercedes, all BMWs, all whatever. It's like, well, there's no all for anything. There's no one rule, because the manufacturer can change suppliers at any point, and I promise you, they're never going to send a memo out to the industry. Hey, all you detailers, by the way, we just changed our suppliers. We're now switching to a softer clear coat, and oh, by the way, instead of applying 3 mils thickness, we've reduced it down to 2 mils, just to give you guys the heads up. Never going to happen.
Yeah.
So, something you need to understand about removing scratches, because that was one of your questions, is that to truly flatten this out. So for example, there's this effect that's called orange peel. So if you literally, and you are familiar with that, I can assume.
I am.
Okay. What that is if you look at an orange and you see how wavy and bumpy the surface is. For a true wet look, what they call a wet look or perfection, you want a flat surface. And by flat, I don't mean gloss or shiny. I mean as in smooth, as in no ripples, no imperfections. It's perfectly flat. Now they have these pads that are called orange peel removal pads. But they're soft, they're malleable, they're not rigid. They're not completely rigid. So I know that if I was working for a true level 10 and I really wanted it perfectly flat, I know that I would have to bust out a very rigid block with sandpaper and sand that completely flat.
Okay.
Because guess what happens? Because a pad, and I'm just going to use this little Rupes, this little 3-inch pad. So, and this is kind of an extreme pad because it's so thick. So the thinner this gets, the less like cushioning it will have to it, right? Do you accept that law or that rule? So if I'm sanding or I'm using a pad to basically remove orange peel, there's a little bit of give to this pad, right? So yes, it will take off the high spots, but to truly make it flat, I need something that's rigid, that will not give. So it will force those high points to be sanded away.
Okay.
So for example, back to our demonstration here, let's say you have a scratch that's right through, and yes, I'm actually going to draw on this paint. Wow. Imagine everyone in audience land going, wow, what a hack, man, he's drawing on this guy's car. Well, I promise you, I'm not making a mark, and it can literally be rubbed off like that. And then there's going to be someone out there saying, oh, dude, you just scratched the paint with your finger. It's like, trust me, I get it, okay? I'm not doing anything I can't fix. And I promise you, Johnny, customer that owns this, will not know. And anyhow, sidebar, sorry. So let's say we've got a scratch like this, okay? And we pull this car in the sun, and you can see what they call in the industry a RID, a random isolated deep scratch. You want to remove that because Johnny customer says, yeah, overall the paint's not too bad. You know, it just needs a good coat of wax. You'll hear that all the time. I need just a couple of good coats of wax. Oh man, I wish you had told me because I brought bad wax with me today. If you had told me before that you wanted the good wax, I could have brought the good wax with me. Once again, I'm just being an asshole because it's just so funny. You know, if people only heard themselves, It's like, oh, you wanted the good wax. Oh, that's going to cost you more because I was going to bust out the bad wax and put a couple of coats of bad wax on your car. You got to pay extra for good wax. I mean, it's kind of absurd when I put it that way, right?
Yeah.
Anyhow, so Johnny customer comes out and says, oh, I just need a couple of good coats of wax, but I noticed it's got this scratch here. I want to see if you can do something about that. So that's where you suddenly kind of go into freak out mode. It's like, oh my gosh, she's got a scratch. How do I remove that? Do I wet sand it away? Can I polish away? What do I do? Well, the simple rule is this. Let's say it's this deeper scratch right here. So if I have this pad that's pliable, malleable, whatever you want to call it, what will happen is that you will start to round off the edges of the scratch. So what happens is the light will reflect, it will catch, and it will reflect off, and it will bounce in endless directions. And every time you move your perspective, it will create a different effect to that scratch.
Okay.
So what you're trying to do is a scratch, if you look at it under a microscope, it will be very revealing, put it that way. With a pad, what you're going to do is you're going to round off those edges so that it is less noticeable.
Okay.
What you want to do is diminish the effect of that scratch. But ultimately, every scratch is created differently.
Yeah.
Every scratch truly is unique.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes what will happen in the process, and I can bust out the most aggressive compound, but because that scratch is deep enough, what will actually happen is I will polish this surrounding area so perfectly that it will actually enhance this, because now what I've done is created a sharper contrast.
Yeah, okay.
So I've made my canvas almost flawless, but the scratch is still there. And so when Johnny customer comes out, what you've actually done is like, it's almost like you've enhanced that scratch.
Yeah.
And that could happen to you. And that's where, if you're really going to do damage control, that happens before you do the damage.
Mm-hmm.
And in this moment, we're not doing damage. We're trying to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
And by damage, what I mean is that the expectations, that's where the damage resides, is within those expectations.
Mm-hmm.
They're either met or unmet.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I had this guy text me and he said, hey, Darren, I need help. I just did this car. The guy wasn't happy, and now he has unrealistic expectations. What do I do? It's like, well, dude, what you did wrong is you didn't manage the expectations before you touch the car. Mm-hmm. That's when you manage expectations. Yeah. The only way you can do that is by asking enough questions so that you understand mm-hmm. what is going on in your customer's head. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Okay. So that's a nuance of scratch removal, is that if the scratch is deep enough, you can't remove it. Mm-hmm. So let me apply what I call the fingernail test. Do you know what that means?
If you can feel it with your fingernail?
Exactly. So I will go up to a scratch, and if I can grab it if I can grab an edge with my fingernail, and trust me, remember that the clear coat is thinner than your fingernail. Mm-hmm. We are talking, in fact, I had this guy in the industry, I don't smoke, but I've seen him, like, a cigarette box of cigarettes, yeah. That wrapper. Have you ever seen how thin that wrapper is?
Yeah.
That's about the thickness of clear coat.
Okay.
Very, very thin.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't take much of a scratch to know that it's all the way through that clear coat. Mm-hmm. And if we remember that once we sand or polish through the clear coat, it's going to change the color of that base coat. Yep. There's no going backwards once you've done that. So if I can catch an edge, I will tell Johnny customers, like, hey, I can catch an edge. I can do what I can to diminish the scratch, but I can't guarantee I can remove it 100%.
Okay. Because
I know that I can, through experience, I can sand to a certain amount and polish, and whatever's left over is left over.
Okay.
So that's what I know, and that's where experience comes in, is like, I can polish, and I know that I'm rounding those edges as I polish. Mm-hmm. But let's say I feel, based on experience, that I can remove it 100%. So I know that I could bust out some like 2000 grit, sand it flat, remove that scratch 100%.
Yeah.
And now what I've created is a surface that is completely uniform, and you would not be able to tell without looking under a microscope, but it's got every scratch in that surface is the same depth because you've now made it uniform. And that's what compounds, the goal is to do, is to create, basically scratch your way to perfection. Mm-hmm. So you create a uniform scratch pattern with a heavy duty compound, and then you come back over it again and you put in finer and finer scratches to the point, and this is where you go from a compound to a polish to a wax. Okay. So a compound does the heavy lifting, but now, to confuse it, they do have compounds that you really can do the heavy lifting, but I don't really understand, because everyone's got their stupid terminology, like diminishing abrasives or isolated whatever. It's like, you know what? I don't even know what to do with those acronyms. Yeah. Because until I get behind the buffer and I know what kind of paint I'm working on, how it responds, it doesn't really matter what they call it. It's like, is it going to produce the results I want or not? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, you're going to go through a lot of polishes and compounds, and that's where I make recommendations. You know, like Scholl's, Menzerna. I mean, there's some awesome compounds, polishes, whatever you want to call them, out there. Okay. So the compound does the heavy lifting. So if you were to sand it, you know that it's going to be sanded flat. If you just remove it with a cutting pad, or whatever type of pad you choose, you know, because this is pliable or malleable, or it's got some cushion to it, you know that at a level it's going to round the edges off of those scratches, whether they're small or deep. Mm-hmm. Now, if they're small enough, then you will remove them completely. But if for the deep scratches, you're going to be essentially rounding it off, and you may not even be able to reach the very bottom of that. So you could round this off and essentially make it almost flat, so now you have just little tiny scratch left over, and that's at the point where you may have created a really sharp contrast of a scratch and a flawless area around it. Okay.